Welcome, everybody, to the Coming Capitalist Reformation, a conversation with Stu Hart. This is part of Net Impact's 30th anniversary event series. My name is Hilary Monzo, and I serve as the Associate Director of Net Impact Programs, and today I'll be serving as event host. We are thrilled you're joining us today for what will surely be a stimulating conversation between Net Impact CEO Karen Johns and academic, educator, author, and thought leader of the responsible business movement, Stuart L. Hart. If you are unfamiliar with Net Impact, we're a global nonprofit organization that aims to inspire and equip emerging leaders to use the tools of business to build a more just and sustainable world. For the past 30 years, our network of nearly 300 chapters around the world works each year to put on over 3,000 events and impact initiatives to accelerate the responsible business movement and help emerging leaders find a career that actively benefits people, planet, and profits, or what's known as the triple bottom line theory. In 2024, Net Impact is kicking off our 30-year anniversary with a year-long event series that highlights the core of our mission, building community and the know-how for the responsible business movement. Today's conversation, and why you're here, of course, will be centered around Stu's newest book, Beyond Shareholder Primacy, Remaking Capitalism for a Sustainable Future, which combines the lessons from the 400-year history of capitalist evolution with practical, transformative strategies for business leaders today. Here's where we're headed. We'll kick off with introductions led by two Net Impact community members from the University of Washington, Seattle. Then we'll dive right into the conversation between Karen and Stu. And then there'll be about 10 minutes for audience Q&A. So as the conversation proceeds, feel free to drop in questions in the chat throughout. And when it's time for Q&A, I'll ask you to raise your hand and unmute yourself and read your question aloud to Stu. Then we'll wrap up with an event survey and closing remarks. Introducing our guest speakers today will be two Net Impact community members from the University of Washington undergraduate chapter who have done incredible work at their university to drive sustainability education at the Foster School of Business. Ava Vaughn is the incoming Net Impact chapter president at the University of Washington, Seattle, an incoming junior who has already supported the UW Seattle chapter enormously as a chapter member. Nicholas Burkhead is the former chapter president at the University of Washington, Seattle, who wasted no time getting into the impact space and is currently serving as assistant project manager for a sustainable building development agency and helped lead the chapter to win the U.S. undergraduate category for this year's Chapter of the Year award. Both Ava and Nicholas's efforts help to ensure that all undergraduate business students have the opportunity to take sustainable business courses at the Foster School of Business at the University of Washington, an incredible accomplishment. Given today's topic of conversation, we're honored to have them here today. Please welcome to the virtual stage incoming and former chapter presidents, Ava Vaughn and Nicholas Burkhead, who will be introducing today's speakers.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction, Hilary. As a new Net Impact chapter president, I am honored today to introduce the CEO of Net Impact, Karen Y. Johns. Karen Johns is a seasoned professional in the educational and nonprofit arena with expertise in strategic planning, engaging diverse communities in philanthropy, diverse workforce strategy, and fund development to help institutions build more effective organizations. Karen joined Net Impact after a tenure as a national director for A Better Chance and serving as the president of the Johns Group, a consultancy specializing in nonprofit management and social business development in the U.S. and the Caribbean. A graduate of Tufts University, Karen is the founder of the Tufts Black Alumni Association and remains an active alumni. Karen is a native of Jamaica and serves in an advisory capacity with several Caribbean-based organizations. I'll hand it off to Nicholas to introduce Stu Hart.
Thank you, Ava, and thank you, Hilary, for that introduction. As a former Net Impact chapter president who advocated for comprehensive climate and sustainability education at the University of Washington Business School, I'm honored today to introduce our guest speaker, Stu Hart. Stuart L. Hart is Professor Emeritus at Cornell University's Johnson School of Management, where he founded the Center for Sustainable Global Enterprise, and Professor in Residence at the University of Michigan's Erb Institute for Global Sustainable Enterprise. He is also co-founder and former director of the Sustainable Innovation MBA program at the University of Vermont's Grossman School of Business. A Fortune 500 consultant, Hart is one of the world's top authorities on the implications of environment and poverty for business strategy. He is the author of numerous publications, including the influential book, Capitalism at the Crossroads, the third edition, Next Generation Business Strategies for a Post-Crisis World. Please welcome to our virtual stage, Karen Johns and Stu Hart.
Nicholas and Ava, it is always so great to see our students shine, and congratulations on leading your chapter to being chapter of the year. And we're especially grateful for you taking time to be part of this session today. Thank you all. It's just so exciting to see all the voices and people popping up from across the country. And I think I even saw someone from London, so we can claim across the world. And really excited to be spending some time with Stu talking about this important book and this important topic. As backdrop, as you heard, this is our 30th year, and Stu was one of the founders of all of this. When we were initially coming together as Student for Responsible Business, Stu at Michigan was part of that leadership group that led to the birth of Net Impact. And a lot has happened in that 30 years. And of course, there's still more work that needs to be done. And one of the things that is important is to see the growth in the responsible business movement. And so we're just really excited and honored as both the founder of what went on to be Net Impact, with this mission of business being a force for good, to now be in this space where 30 years later, Stu is not only at it, but as we all know, sits at the top of this movement. And really, I think is the best person to open the door and shed light on this topic. And because we have so many issues to cover, and I know questions that will abound, we're going to jump right in. One of the things we wanted to do as context was talk about the movement that has happened in those 30 years. And one of the windows to look at that is looking at the position of chief sustainability officers. The Weintraub group talked about that in 2011, there were only about 29 chief sustainability officer positions. That's grown sixfold to about a little over 180 right now. And we see that popping up. We see students in particular looking at sustainable careers as a path they want to follow when they graduate. So no doubt that industry has changed. But wanted to get a sense from you, Stu, as to now that we're at that juncture, why the book and why now? And what is the perspective, having been there 30 years, that you can share from that vantage point?
Yeah. Hey, Karen, thank you. It's good to be with all of you. I guess if you hang around long enough, it gives you some point of view. I'm actually old enough to remember back in the day, like in the late 80s, early 90s, when we were first looking to stand up this dual degree program in Michigan, now called the Erb Dual Master's Program. It was before sustainability was a term of art, right? And there was no such thing as chief sustainability officers. The people that were working in that space then were called EHS, environment, health, and safety. That was the term of art, right? And it was called environmental management. That stood for everything, right, back then, right? I think one of the defining features of this evolution is how buzzwords come and go, and how acronyms, come and go. It's really pretty amazing when you think about it. From EHS to then came the MDGs, around the Millennium Development Goals. You may not remember those, right? But that's sort of what really brought the social aspect front and center, especially kind of poverty. And that's when a lot of the work on inequality and base of the pyramid really began to emerge, sort of turn of the last century. But then come the SDGs, right? And the SDGs now kind of usher in a whole new age. You begin to see chief sustainability officers begin to flourish more and more, kind of mid-decade, kind of 2015 timeframe, as you just pointed out. And now we've transitioned once again into the age of nothing less than ESG, right? And ESG is sort of all about metrics, right? It's sort of driven from the financial side, So huge preoccupation with things like reporting and certifications, and especially now with the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and so forth. So, we've come a long way, to be sure, over the last 30 years, but we haven't come nearly far enough, right? I mean, it all started with eco-efficiency. That was kind of the watchword 30 years ago. That's what put it on the map in business schools. That's what made it relevant for business. Before that, like in the 80s, I tried, right? But you would be readily rebuffed as, this is something that doesn't belong in a business school. But eco-efficiency made it business relevant because eco-efficiency reduces cost and risk and drop right to the bottom line. I think one of the things that's been consistent over the last 30 years is that the sustainable business movement has been embedded in the larger capitalist logic coming out of the US, in the 70s and 80s of shareholder primacy, right? I mean, that this is a particular operating system for capitalism. And the sustainable business movement in large measure was a reaction to that, because the shareholder primacy form of capitalism goes hand in glove with neoliberal political order, right? And while that's beginning to fall asunder now, it was, ascendant in the 80s, right? So sustainable business had to fit into the logic of maximizing shareholder value, or else it wasn't going to happen. And eco-efficiency did that quite well, right? Because it dropped right to the bottom line, right? In terms of cost reduction and risk reduction with, reducing waste, reducing emissions, right? Rather than spewing it out and cleaning it up after. So that was the big aha, right? That kind of put sustainable business on the map. And it's sort of continued down that track. We've seen expansion into, kind of full life cycle product stewardship. We now refer to it as scope 3, but that has a lot of impact on things like branding, and reputation and legitimacy and right to operate. All those things I think can be tied readily to the logic of maximizing shareholder value and fit within that kind of larger paradigm. We begin to see, though, we kind of bump up against the limits of that. I think that's where we are now. We have the frenzy with reporting and certifications, I think all useful and important. But I think if we're honest with ourselves, if we take a hard look at the state of the world, we can see that sort of the dials on the global dashboard are still headed in the wrong direction, right? I mean, as much as sustainable business has grown and flourished, and there's more CSOs now, climate change is still running rampant. The sixth extinction is well underway. Inequality continues to increase almost everywhere in the world, right? In some cases at toxic levels, to the point where it begins to have societal impacts, kind of an unraveling. And we see what happens in terms of the rise of populism and so forth. All those things, I think, this form of capitalism has driven. So the reason I was motivated to write the book, kind of thinking about it, 2017, 2018 timeframe, was sort of realizing that the sustainable business movement, as we've conceived it, and as all of my work up until then really had been focused on how do we make this stick, how do we, quote, make the business case for sustainability, just wasn't working, right? It just wasn't getting us there. And that the only way that we could imagine, that we could actually get to the kind of transformative change that was required, because I wrote the piece Capitalism at the Crossroads, but even earlier in 97, wrote an article entitled Beyond Greening, Strategies for a Sustainable World, that drew the distinction between the kinds of greening initiatives like eco-efficiency and product stewardship that simply reduce negative impact of current products and processes, from what I call beyond greening, which was about leapfrog, next generation, disruptive innovation, inherently clean and regenerative technology commercialization, and using the power of enterprise to serve and lift the underserved at the base of the pyramid. And while there's been lots of talk about that over the last 25 plus years, it still hasn't happened, right? We're still stuck in greening by and large. And that just can't happen, right? I mean, so I reached the conclusion that the only way that we can begin to think about realizing the more transformative beyond greening changes is to actually change the ground rules and operating system for capitalism itself, because shareholder primacy just simply prevents the kinds of innovations that we need to happen, right? And hence the book, right? And a deep dive into history to try to understand how we could have possibly gotten here.
I think one of the things we're struck with reading about the book or hearing is sort of some sense of repetition of moments. And you talked about that in terms of cycles. And in chapter 3 of the book, you especially point to the fact that we're entering the third Reformation, and really that this next decade will be critical to that. So some of the lessons from the past and where we are looking ahead. And can you talk a little bit more about what the third Reformation looked like and its implications for the next decade or more, particularly as we march towards 2030 and beyond?
Yeah, yeah. As I begin to, I'm no historian, certainly not trained as a historian, but sort of put on the historian's hat for several years, had read widely and deeply, not just in economics, much more broadly, also cultural history, social history, and so forth, to try to make sense of this thing we call capitalism. And the term capitalism only dates to the 19th century, right? That the mid 19th century, but as a set of practices and as a mindset, as a way of thinking about the world and as a way of thinking about, quote, commerce, it dates back really to the 1600s, right? I mean, the first corporations came into being, literally in the year 1600. Think the British East India Company, right? It's a mercantilist phenomenon. And the British East India Company was the very first joint stock limited liability corporation funded with private equity. Back then it was called adventure capital. Because like the English, the Dutch and the English were the originators of this. Before that, sort of raiding missions down the west coast of Africa were mostly funded by the Portuguese and the Spanish crown, along with Italian financiers, which is where the so-called explorers really learned their business model, of raiding and slaving down the west coast of Africa. But that then morphed, into a commercial model that the Dutch and the English originated, and that then took those kind of sailing voyages to the east around Africa, to the Spice Islands, and then to India, and ultimately the conquest of India by the British East India Company. But then also the British East India Company went to the New World, along with a lot of other corporations that were formed by the English to settle the New World. The New World was settled by corporations, right? By crown corporations called trading companies. And, it was sort of in that spirit, because the trading companies were mercantilists, which meant they were out to extract resources wherever they could, to maximize profit for the shareholders without really regard to consequences, and then to externalize whatever negative impacts there were, and were necessary to subjugate peoples and enslave them. The British East India Company had its own private army, right, for exactly that purpose, which they used with impunity in India. And that ultimately, after a couple hundred years of that in India, it basically hollowed India out. India in the year 1600 accounted for 25% of global trade and manufacturing. China, another 25%. It was half of world GDP, in quotes, were India and China. The British were like a tiny backwater, like 2% of the population, and 2% of manufacturing. They were nothing, in 1600. But with the rise of the Industrial Revolution technologies, suddenly they could begin using coal power to make textiles more cheaply, and that resulted in beginning to export those finished products back to India and simply extract the cotton. And then in the New World, of course, to grow the cotton with slave labor, right? It was the kind of the source of, well, in addition to sugar, right, in the Caribbean, kind of slave-grown cotton was really the name of the game, and it's what really allowed that industry to become a global industry with the British at the helm. Well, the American, colonists didn't like this very much. The Indians ended up submitting to it, tragically. But in America, there was a thing called the American Revolution, which was really a revolution against the British trading companies. And of course, the founders had also intellectual motivation. They had intellectual influence, and it came largely from the Scottish Enlightenment and a guy named Adam Smith, who I think, many of us misinterpret today. I mean, I actually went back and read The Wealth of Nations and the Theory of Moral Sentiments. I don't necessarily advise that, but I did. And one of the things I discovered was this guy was really a radical. right? I mean, he was really in many ways the first, kind of anti-corporate activist. Because when you think about it, his theory of the market economy was a direct affront to the way in which commerce was being committed at the time by the British, namely mercantilist, monopoly-oriented trading companies. He railed against them, right? If you go back and read his work, he thought that that the English were just using the wrong approach. He hated the idea of monopoly. First of all, obviously, he believed in competition and markets, right? Was small players that can't influence prices. And he hated the idea of that. He was an anti-slavery advocate. So he hated the idea of extraction, and he hated the idea, and using slavery as part of the business model was something that he was appalled by. And then he especially hated he obviously advocated you have to make a profit, right, in order to be in business. But the idea of extracting wealth by owners, right, to purchase what he called personal baubles and trinkets appalled him, right? In his view, it was all about reinvesting in the business so you could employ more people and raise the wealth of everyone. That was his theory of the wealth of nations. He was inspired by the Greeks and the Romans, right, and the idea of virtue. He was a professor of moral philosophy, not economics. Economics didn't exist as a field for another 100 years, right? He was a professor of moral philosophy at the University of Glasgow, and so thought in those terms. He was heavily influenced by, by professors of religion and by professors of ethics and so forth. So the idea of virtue, which meant to the classicists, behavior with an interest in the common good, right? It meant behaving with virtue meant, being lovely, as he described it, being not loved, but lovely. And what that meant was worthy of being loved, demonstrating that you are worthy of being loved. And by behaving in such a way, you have a clear conscience. And that is what the pursuit of happiness is all about. Pursuit of happiness comes from the Greeks and the Romans, right? I mean, so it's no coincidence that it was used in the founding documents of the US. And that's what it meant, pursuit of the common good. And that was how he viewed the role of business and the idea of markets and a market economy. So it was completely anathema to the way that the mercantilists were behaving. And it inspired the Americans to put corporations back in a box in the early days of the Republic, right? If you go back and read your history, you'll discover that corporations were very carefully controlled, right, in the early days of America. You could only be incorporated at the state level. That's still the case, right? Now, a lot's changed. Back then, you had to declare a public purpose. You can only be incorporated in one state for a specific public purpose for a defined period of time, and your charter was continuously reviewed. And if you diverged from that, it was revoked. So corporations were very carefully controlled. Most business was conducted using just sole proprietorships and limited partnerships and that sort of thing, including Southern slave plantations, right, which were generally not corporations. The first corporations were the railroads, right? They became larger. And then with the Industrial Revolution, you have oil and steel and so forth that seemed to demand more capital investment. As they grew in scale, then those business people, those industrialists, those tycoons were able, using their market power as they began to develop monopolies again, to undo a lot of those restrictions and limitations that were first applied, such that corporations were once again running rampant, right? You had the age, concentration coming back again, monopoly control again, exploitation of workers and so forth in the corporate scheme, right? Obviously, that had been going on in the South all along. But from the standpoint of corporations, by the late 19th century, we're right back to the original source code of mercantilism, which is maximize profit for the owners at all costs without regard to consequences. And there's plenty of consequences that result from that. That was during that period of time that the whole concept of externalities first emerged in the new field of neoclassical economics, by Alfred Marshall and Pigou, right? Pigou is the guy who wrote the book called Welfare Economics, right? Which posited the idea that companies should take some responsibility for externalities, negative externalities that they inflict on others through their business activities. So the Gilded Age kind of took us right back to the source code, only to see another counter movement called the progressive movement, in America, during, starting right at the turn of the century, but continuing on, with the after the crazed 20s, right, and the meltdown of the market in 1929, 30s were a time of real reflection, the rise of FDR and so forth. And lo and behold, a whole new kind of logic of capitalism emerges in the 30s and 40s, such that after in the post-war years, while there were lots of blind spots for companies in America, that was my childhood time, right? Like, environment and women and race, but the point is that they were run not just to maximize short-term profits to drive up the share price in the short term. They were run to build a middle class and to be corporate citizens in the communities where they existed, even though they were polluting like hell. But that's a separate, there were blind spots for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But the point is that was the logic was not just to serve one stakeholder, namely the shareholder. The logic was to serve a range of stakeholders, and especially to create promotion ladders and middle class pay. And that's when America built the middle class, right? Was in those post-war years, only to see it once again revert starting in the 70s. We like to attribute Milton Friedman's 1970 piece as kind of the clarion call for that. In many ways it was, but there were a lot of other contributors, such that by the 80s, we had once again reverted to the mercantilist, neoliberalist, shareholder primacy, profit to drive returns for shareholders at all cost as the logic of capitalism. So this history kind of gave me, how shall I say, it made me optimistic in some ways, because it became clear to me that while the source code is as I've described, there had been at least 2 times in the past when there had been counter movements that were pretty successful, right, at putting it back in the box, or at least taking the rough edges off for some period of time. I don't think either of those 2 previous, what I would think of as reformations, actually kind of excised the cancer genes of capitalism. But I think that's our opportunity, and that's our duty now to do that, right? I think of it as CRISPR for capitalism. There are a lot of good genes to capitalism, right? I mean, I think the idea of competition, of markets, of private ownership, of incentives. I mean, there's a lot of good genes to capitalism, but there's some really nasty ones. And the idea of shareholder primacy and profit maximization only for only the shareholders is probably the central cancer gene that I think it's our duty actually to excise that. We need CRISPR for capitalism in the coming years. And as I say in the book, I think the last 30 plus years of what we think of as CSR, or the sustainability movement, or conscious capitalism, whatever we want to call it, that is the third Reformation. We're in the midst of it right now. It is nowhere near complete, but it must become such.
Well, I'm glad you talk about CSR and sort of the movement, but I think again, what's been interesting about the book is your look back as you look forward. And I would imagine even as you sat down and wrote the book, it'd be interesting to have you even think about the optimism, because one of the things I'd love for you to address is talking to, I know there's several members of the audience who are in corporate space, probably sitting in those chief sustainability officers role as we speak, or within a corporation wanting to be part of that change, to be part of the movement for the third Reformation. What advice, what are the recommendations you would give, particularly at a time where there's, very public pushback to some of these issues that I think has even evolved faster than, say, even a couple of years ago, post COVID, post the sense of possibilities. Some I would imagine would say there's even much more visible pushback in terms of these issues now, and we really are at that pinhead moment where it could go either way, right? And so I think any insights you can share to folks sitting in these chairs in a corporate setting that want to be part of this change, what advice would you give?
Yeah. Well, with that point, the fact that we now see this, sort of pushback, this anti-ESW, anti-woke, sort of counter movement to the counter movement, as it were. First of all, somewhat uniquely American, right? I mean, if you travel around the rest of the world, for example, I do a fair amount in India. The term ESG has a totally different valence there. It's actually getting a lot of traction there. And even in Europe, I think there's a different interpretation. So in some ways, this is uniquely American, just like the current version of shareholder primacy is an American phenomenon that has infected the rest of the world. So, I think I start with that observation. But having said that, I think I'm also reminded by, of a saying variously attributed to Gandhi, that when it comes to sort of social movements, which I view that this is a social movement that we're talking about, that, as I believe he said, although it's variously interpreted, that first you're ignored, then you're laughed at, then you get fought, then you win. So we should expect that there's going to be a fight, right? Well, if you expect nothing less, it means you're being taken seriously, right? And you're not being ignored or laughed at anymore. It's actually a serious thing. And in many ways, I view this as the last kind of death, sort of the death throes of a dying system. But the incumbents don't give up easy, is really what it comes down to. So I think we should actually be, in some ways, heartened by that, kind of steel in the spine, because this is when it gets real. We're at to the point now where it's real. And I think in companies, so in the book, I have a section about corporate transformation. There are things that companies, I think we can do in companies now, even before we're able to transform the larger kind of rules of capitalism, the operating system, which we'll talk about a little bit too, right? But things because I think corporations now, with the rise of ESG, have become so preoccupied with the metrics, right? It's so much about making sure that we get the right certifications and get the right data for the ratings, and how do we measure carbon, what's the carbon accounting we're going to use, and make sure, now that we have to do mandatory reporting, on and on and on. I think that becomes such a preoccupation that you can kind of lose sight of the forest for the trees. And that a lot of companies, I think, are still in the position where they've adopted kind of flowery statements of purpose. Most large companies now have these purpose statements about, what they stand for, that sound great, but then you kind of look further, and then they have sustainability goals. Almost all have, that have chief sustainability officers have sustainability goals, and never the twain shall meet. That so many of the sustainability goals relate to what we would think of as, in the modern lexicon of the greenhouse gas protocol, scope 1 and 2, right? So there's lots of goals about energy use and water use and DEI goals and so forth. Most of them are sort of four walls, scope 1 and 2 oriented. There's some, like especially carbon goals, right, which are broader, although a lot of companies restrict their carbon reduction goals just to scope 1 and 2, right? There's a lot of that going on. But at the end of the day, there's the sustainability goals. Oh, and then usually there's kind of like a post-it note on the wall for net zero by 2050, right? Without any real serious thinking as to what that really means or how you might get there. Maybe you purchase some offsets, as a way to get started. So, I sort of looked at that state of the world and said, well, when you look under the hood, there's really not much there that connects the purpose to the sustainability goals. And, I'm a strategy professor, so I'm kind of looking for those things, Yeah. And that has more to do with the extent to which these ideas about societal purpose and the goals for the positive impact on the world, that ought to be reflected in the actual, sort of operating plan, long-term plan, strategy, and resource allocation and investment plan for the company. And if it's not, then it's really hype. It's sustainability hyperbole. And I think we're still kind of stuck in a sustainability hyperbole mode in a lot of companies, because it takes real work to engage the commercial side of the company in this, which is what it takes, right? So in the book, I kind of draw a distinction between these three different levels, and when it comes to sustainability within a company and linking it to strategy and purpose. The kind of like the connective tissue, right, between the statement of purpose and what the company really does and its sustainability goals. So the first level, I talk about foundational sustainability goals. And foundational sustainability goals are those that really can be taken on by functional leaders in the company. They are mostly internal. And so that would be, those are things like, operational goals like energy use and waste reduction and so forth, and water use in scope 1 and 2. Those can be taken on by the operating people right in the company, and they should be. procurement. Increasingly, there's sustainable sourcing, and the procurement people can take that one on. Now, it's complicated for sure, but it's, that's something that procurement and others can really take on in concert with product design, right, and new product development. In terms of inclusion and diversity, inclusion, that sort of DEI, at least internally, that's an HR thing, right? And then you can think in terms of new competency development. Well, that's R&D. I mean, R&D can take on a lot of this, and those are really important, what I think of as foundational sustainability goals, where functional people in the company actually can take them on. But when it comes to really making stuff stick out in the world, that has to do with what the company actually does in the world, both not only in terms of how it sources, but most importantly, its products and services and the impact they have, what we would think of today as scope 3, those necessarily have to be what I call business aspirations. And the commercial side of the company has to be actively engaged in the development of those business aspirations, or else they're not business aspirations if they don't have revenue targets attached to them. And many don't, right? Many don't pass that test. So I talk about how, and we've worked a lot with a company called Griffith Foods, Karen, which you know very well. We have Griffith's chairman on our Net Impact board, a guy named Brian Griffith, where for the last 5 years, there's been a real effort to develop those business aspirations for Griffith Foods, which involves deeply engaging people on the commercial side. And that doesn't come fast and easily, right? And so that's sort of second level. And then there's another level above and beyond that I talk about in the book that I call a corporate quest. And the corporate quest relates more to the more system level change. In other words, even companies that are inspired to really try to make stuff stick in a new way, to do beyond greening, right? To do beyond greening, to build next generation inherently clean regenerative businesses that can also serve and lift the underserved. The rules of shareholder primacy make that difficult, as I said earlier. And so the idea of a quest is how can we as a company do something, take initiative in a way that's material for us, that can begin to change the systems out there in the world to accelerate our business aspirations. And that means linking up and joining forces with others, building collaboration ecosystems and so forth. And for those of you that know Paul Pullman and Andrew Winston's newish book, Net Positive, really great. I highly recommend it. So they talk, a lot of their book is about system change, and they talk about sort of 3 levels of system change. And I think they really focus on, think of it as a tree. There's sort of a canopy level system change, and that has to do with issues and problems in the world, deforestation and slave labor and so forth. And it's important that companies tackle specific issues and build collaboration to address some of them that are especially material for them. But, just like the canopy and the fruit of a tree, there's constantly new ones popping up, right? It's really protein, and it's tough if you're just an issue manager. Sometimes you get out over your skis and take a position on something that's rapidly emerging, and that can result in blowback. We've seen that already. And so while that's important, you can't do that alone, right? So I think Pullman and Winston talk about the trunk of the tree, which is becoming a net positive advocate for new policies and public policy change, to align your lobbying with the policy agenda, so that you're not talking out of both sides of your mouth. That so often the lobbying organization is spending lots of money to prevent exactly the things you say you want to do in terms of sustainability goals. So becoming a net positive policy advocate is really important too, in terms of system change on things that are important to where you want to take the company in the future from a sustainability point of view. But what I focus on in the book, and then I think this will lead to our last question, are the root system of the tree. And I think of the root system as the institutions that support and enable capitalism itself and define it, right? To kind of give it its features and its kind of operating parameters, its ground rules. And the 2 that I focus on in the book, one is the financial infrastructure, and in particular, I focus on public equity markets, which I view as a really important root cause of our problem, because right now they're being run by people who have been brainwashed in business school for the last 40 years to believe that shareholder primacy is the right and only way. And when you think about it, it's really just a story, right? The idea of shareholder primacy is a theory that came out of the University of Chicago's economics department, 40, 50 years back, that was perpetrated on the world became kind of the operating logic for companies, and then, embedded in neoliberal policies like, privatization and deregulation and so forth during the 80s. And that's produced the result that we're living with still today. But it's really just a story, right? There's nothing preordained about the idea that stock price should be driven by quarterly earnings growth. And the only way to get maximized quarterly earnings growth is by tying CEO compensation to quarterly earnings growth and stock price, because CEOs, are agents and they're badly motivated. They don't have the interests of the quote owners in mind, right? This is the story of shareholder primacy. And it really is just that. It's a story, and most of it's been debunked by now, right? The idea of agency theory has been thoroughly debunked, right? So most of the underpinnings of the ideas behind shareholder primacy no longer hold any water. And so it's really just a social construction that's been perpetrated on us. And for markets to be driven by that story is just that. It's a social construction, and we can change it, right? We can, because public equity markets are purely trading markets. We could simply decide that a new set of things should be drivers of share price. Why shouldn't it be reinvestment rate rather than stock buybacks? Stock buybacks used to be illegal, after the Great Depression. They were allowed again by the SEC starting in the 80s, and that's what's driven a lot of what we see. But why wouldn't reinvestment rate or payment of living wage going back to the way it was in the 50s and 60s? Why shouldn't that drive stock price? Or how about carbon footprint? Why couldn't that drive? It could be anything we want it to be, because public equity markets are purely trading markets. And the way that we get to the new story is with the other, what I think is fundamental root cause institution, and that is business schools.
And now so reading my mind, and in some ways bringing us full circle. We talked at the beginning about how you were there when Net Impact was founded by students. And one of the things that encourages us with the work that Nicholas and Ava and so many other students are doing, how they're still advocating for change, starting with making sure they're being taught these things in business schools, but they're coming out expecting some of that. So would love for you to share a little bit, and I suspect you'll get questions about this in the Q&A, which I know there are several people eager to ask questions, so we want to make sure there's time for them. What advice would you give to young people who are looking to bring sustainability into the classrooms and making sure they're leaving those institutions with a change view that can impact the very corporate setting that you talk about? So maybe 1 or 2 tips, and as I said, I suspect there'll be even more questions from the audience around this particular topic.
Yep. Yeah. So in many ways, this has kind of been my life's work, right? And trying to make this sort of thing happen in business schools, starting in Michigan. Then I was at UNC for 5 years, and we started a Center for Sustainable Enterprise there. I was at Cornell. And then most recently, Karen, as you know, I got involved in this new program at the University of Vermont. An old friend and colleague became the dean, a guy named Sanjay Sharma, and he opened the possibility of starting over, right? He abolished the existing MBA program, and we had the rare opportunity of starting with a clean sheet where we developed a completely new program from scratch that was not shareholder primacy based. Because the truth of the matter is, most of what I've done over the course of the last 30 years in my career at Michigan, at UNC, at Cornell, in terms of starting centers and concentrations and so forth, are what Sanjay and I have coined saddlebag sustainability plays, right? In other words, they just hang off the side, right? There's a center, and it can be really high quality saddlebags. I don't mean to demean saddlebags. Saddlebags are great, but but they still just hang off the side, whether it's a center for sustainable business or responsible, whatever it might be, and then usually second-year elective courses, right, in an MBA program. So you don't have to take them, right? You can, so maybe 20% of the students in a typical 2-year MBA program have significant, kind of exposure to any ideas having to do with sustainability. There's a big push now to try to do core integration, bring sustainability in the core. This was the mantra when we first started 30 years ago, and it still hasn't happened, right? The whole idea 30 years ago was, well, we just don't have good teaching materials, right? If we just develop cases and readings and mock syllabi and so forth, then it'll just be adapted. Well, we did all that 30 years ago, and it still hasn't been adopted. So we're kidding ourselves if we think that the existing core courses are somehow going to transform themselves. Everything that we know about organizational change tells us that just isn't going to happen. There's way too much momentum and inertia to continue doing it the way it is, mostly by the professors themselves. So deans can push, and they are beginning to push when it comes to core integration, but it just doesn't happen. So I come to the conclusion that it's really about beginning to create the logic for starting entirely new degree programs. And okay, Vermont, it's possible to abolish the program because it wasn't that great to begin with. Obviously, if you're a top 20 business school or a top 50 business school, you're not going to abolish the existing incumbent program. But there's no reason why you couldn't start a new product. That's what good companies do. They start new products to compete with their existing ones and hopefully make them obsolete, right? That you'd rather creatively destroy yourself than have somebody else creatively destroy you.
Mhm.
So I think the logic of starting new programs from scratch, and that's how you get faculty really engaged, because I watched it happen when we did it at Vermont, is really important, I think, when it comes to curricular innovation. But there's more to it than just that when it comes to kind of leading the transformation in business education. There's the upstream piece, right? How do you attract the right students? What are the messages you're sending about the culture of the school? How do you set culture during orientation? I think as students and also business leaders, you can have a lot of influence. Like, what do people hear in the weeks and months before they come? What's the communication they're getting? And what is orientation telling them? Like, even back like 30 years ago at Michigan, when I was there, we launched a program. It's no longer there, tragically. It was called Global Citizenship. And it was 2 full days of orientation where it got students out into the field. We took them into Detroit and took them out. It sent a signal, right, about what business education is all about, what it should be focused on. And so I think orientation is a place where you can really have some leverage and get some traction. And then lastly, I think the downstream piece, right? What's the placement office, right? So like most business school placement offices are focused on jobs that just perpetuate the status quo, that pay a lot of money because you got a lot of debt to service because the tuition's ridiculously high. It's sort of a vicious circle. So, it's just about bringing consulting firms and Wall Street in because those pay the most money and we charge a lot of tuition. So you have to be able to service the debt. Well, we faced this one with our new program at Vermont that we wouldn't be able to do that. None of those companies would recruit at our program. So, and it would be disingenuous if we just tried to do a bolt-on MBA placement office. So we've been building something we call launch, not placement. And it's focused on sort of building a network of practitioners that are doing the kinds of things already that we think are important in pathways that make sense for the students, like corporate transformation, like clean and regenerative tech startup and venturing, like inclusive and base of the pyramid venturing, like transformational consulting, like impact investing, those, and then of course, some students want to go the B Corp route, right? That sort of work in a B Corp already. So different students have different energies, have different passions, but there are a set of pathways, I think, for those that are interested in transformation. And we need to figure out how we get our careers people to actually pay attention to those pathways. And so you can begin to pressure the career office a little because they don't cater to those at all, right? I mean, in a lot of ways, business schools aren't really business schools anymore. They're consulting and finance schools. They don't put people in actual companies anymore in great numbers. That's what they should be doing, in my view. And I think we can get back to that. So you can have leverage by beginning to influence the career development office. And career development is also important when it comes to orientation. So the bookend pieces, right, orientation and career development and career office are really important leverage points for transformation in addition to curricular innovation. And I'll stop there.
And I knew that when we started this, that we would never have enough time. But I think that is a perfect place to end it, talking about the catalyst that students can be and the change that can happen with students internally in these institutions before they even enter the world. And I, again, just continue to be excited by the students we see from the Net Impact community that's part of that. And with that as a stop, I want to turn it over to Hillary to have us at least get a couple of voices from the audience. Never enough time, and we encourage you to reach out to Stu and get some questions answered on your own, but turn it over to Hillary so we can get some audience questions. And again, thanks so much to Stu for this. This, I think, for everyone has just been a perfect afternoon of conversation.
Awesome. Thanks, Karen. Yeah, so the next 10 minutes will be questions for Stu. I know Nicholas had a question. So Nicholas, I'm going to ask you to unmute and you can go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Stu and Karen. First of all, let me say thank you very much for this conversation, and it was super enlightening. Something that makes me feel demoralized sometimes is a feeling that this topic often feels like well-meaning white-collar employees sort of talking to each other, and it's a very similar group of people sort of pulling their hair out. And I'd love to know, in both of your experiences, what have you found to be the most successful strategies for coalition building and widening the aperture beyond what I would describe as current or aspiring chief sustainability officers?
Yeah, I mean, Karen, I can take a push.
No, please do. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as I think about it, it's really about sort of genuine commitment to do something different. And what do I mean by that? I mean, both in companies, I think, and in business schools, there's often, lots of well-stated intentions. It's like having that flowery sounding statement of purpose up on the wall and so forth. But then when you look under the hood, it's not really happening. And I get back to my little discussion about what we've been trying to do at Griffith Foods and what it's taken to really bring the engagement of those in the commercial side of the company into this. I mean, it requires, and the same thing's true with business schools, that you can't just, sort of cajole or coerce faculty into, well, you need to bring sustainability into your core course, to make it kind of a compliance act. It does. I don't think that's the way the world works. That's not how organizations really change. I think there has to be some really concerted, authentic dedication to doing something in a different way. And that ultimately comes from the top, and it comes from resource allocation, right? That people, unless you're like us, right? Like we're like you say, we're the passionate ones, Nick, right? So the preaching to the converted, that'll always go on. But if you're going to really bring kind of those people, the broader group that are necessary for things to really change, then there has to be not only some incentive for them to do it, but almost an expectation that they do it, and it becomes part of their job, right? And that means actually that senior leadership has to make it part of their job, more than just like a few throwaway end of the year goals. Like at Vermont, when we built the new program, we had to build a new faculty, right? And that meant that it became part of the faculty's job. They were being paid to help us build this new program, not just to say, well, you need to bring at least one class in your core course that has to do with sustainability. So the faculty complies by changing the title of that one class and puts the word sustainability. That's compliance behavior. That's never going to get us there, right? But I think that still tends to be the approach that we take.
Great, thanks, Stu. Next, we have Jim Stoner, and I will ask to unmute. So you should be able to unmute yourself, Jim.
First of all, that's a wonderful talk, Stu, and I'd love to have a recording of it. In Waksan,
Good to see you, Jim.
India, next week, every day of the week for 1 hour, it is reporting on its efforts to transform its entire undergraduate and business curriculum to be fully aligned with the need for a poverty-alleviating, sustainable, flourishing, regenerating world. We would love to have you help us if you would like to do so. I completely agree with you about the importance of starting alternative business education opportunities, but there's a world of business as usual teaching, and we don't want to leave it the way it is. And if you would like to help Awaksan continue to move forward on its efforts, I'm sure they'd love to have you do it, and we'd love to see your video. And they just set up a net impact chapter this year as part of that 12-month transformation they're involved in. So thanks so much for an absolutely outstanding presentation.
Well, Jim, I appreciate that. Thank you. And I would be delighted to, however I can be helpful, just let me know. I mean, this is actually something that I'm, in my later years, they're trying to commit some energy to. I'm working with a few other schools. I mean, it is interesting that a lot of the energy, maybe unsurprising, that a lot of the energy for wholesale innovation, in other words, creation of entirely new programs, is coming from the second tier business schools, because it's existential for them. It's classic Clayton Christensen disruptive innovation coming from the bottom up, that the industry incumbents, are probably the last ones to do that. And the really disruptive innovation comes from, that's like Vermont, right? Vermont was kind of an unknown business school, kind of a regional place. But now, this program has kind of put it on the map. It actually has built some reputation and brand around this idea, which I think other schools can do too. And for second tier schools, it's existential for many of them. Some of them are just shutting down, flat out shutting down. And I think we'll see more of that because the traditional 2-year MBA is a declining category, declining applications everywhere, right? So, I think the deans increasingly know that that's the case, and they know that it's not going to be forever. Nothing's forever. And so it's the time, I think, is rapidly approaching where there's more and more traction for this way of thinking. One of the things, Karen, that we've talked about is maybe net impact. That net impact can be a catalytic force for something like a teaching academy. And we've had some discussions about this at Ross, that part of what's missing that makes it difficult for existing core faculty to bring this stuff in is they just don't feel competent, right? And that it's no longer the problem that they think that it's crazy, stupid, or communist or whatever. Most faculty in business schools can see that these issues are real. They just don't want to walk into a classroom and feel like they don't know what they're talking about. They want to be the expert, right? And so the best way, the only way maybe for that to happen is they actually have to be incented to devote time and effort to increasing their bandwidth and knowledge level about this content, right? So the idea of a teaching academy where, the schools pay, or we raise money from donors to pay the faculty to come to a teaching academy with peers, so it can be a networking opportunity, but to actually kind of bone up, to learn more about these issues and how you might effectively bring them in and talk about them in a business classroom setting might be a really important way, because I think a lot of it is sort of bandwidth expansion and competency building.
Absolutely. And this is definitely something we're looking at as part of our 30th and looking ahead. I know we're coming up on time, so I'm going to turn it over to Hillary. There are even more questions in the chat, which we'll follow up with offline. And thanks to all of you again for my last second, and especially to Stu. This has just been such an illuminating and timely conversation. Hillary?
Thanks, Karen. Yes, we have so many good questions in the chat. And Stu, maybe we can take the responses to all these good questions. I mean, they're talking about the degrowth movement and the unions and AI and others, so many good questions. So maybe we can talk offline about how we can get you to respond to those questions and share out with our attendees today. We are at time and want to respect the hour that you've been with us today. So in closing, you can find Stu's book on Amazon Kindle, or the Stanford University Press. Please check it out. We also would love to hear what you thought of today's event. Please scan the QR code and you can take the survey link in the chat, and we'll also drop the link to the event survey in the chat. If you want to hear more conversations like this or have any feedback on how to make these better, we read every single submission into the survey and take them really seriously. So thank you for your feedback. And Stu Hart and Karen, thank you so much for this conversation. I think we could go for another hour talking about this topic, and the audience has been so engaged. You've been incredible. So thank you so much. Keep an eye out for future NI30 events in your inbox. The conversation is just getting started. And I'll leave this QR code up for the rest of the call. And Stu, as I said, I'll connect with you offline. These are some really great questions in the chat. So maybe a blog post is in order with your responses to these questions. But everyone, it is 101. So thank you so much for being here. And thank you again, Stu Hart.
Thanks, everyone.
My pleasure.
All right, everybody, take care. We'll make sure that we get all the questions in the chat. I'm volunteering Stu Hart for a potential blog post on Net Impact with these great questions. So if you have questions, please drop them in the chat, and we'll see what we can do. Stu is really busy, so we'll see what we can do. But thank you so much for being such an engaged audience, and have a wonderful rest of your week. Take care.
Thanks.